The morning alarm at Riverside Air Force Base cut through the desert silence at 0530 hours. But Sarah Mitchell was already awake. She had been staring at the ceiling of her cramped quarters for the past hour, listening to the distant rumble of F-16s preparing for their dawn patrol. At 26, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that invisibility was often the safest option in a world that had already decided what she was worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beyond the perimeter fence, a harsh landscape of sand and scrub brush that seemed to mirror the isolation Sarah felt every morning as she pulled on her base security uniform. The patch on her sleeve read, "Security Forces," but everyone knew what that really meant. She was a gate guard, a fence walker, someone whose primary job was to check identification cards and patrol empty stretches of asphalt while the real airmen flew million-dollar aircraft. Overhead, Sarah caught her reflection in the small mirror mounted above her sink as she braided her auburn hair into the regulation style. Her green eyes held a weariness that seemed disproportionate to her years, the kind of exhaustion that came not from physical labor, but from constantly having to prove she belonged somewhere she was no longer welcome. At 5'6", she had the lean build of someone who stayed in excellent physical condition, though few people at Riverside bothered to notice. To most of the personnel on base, she was simply part of the scenery, as forgettable as the guard posts and as useful as the concrete barriers that lined the runways. The walk to the Security Forces building took her past the heart of the base, where mechanics were already swarming over aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness. The air smelled of jet fuel and possibility, a combination that had once filled her with excitement but now served as a daily reminder of dreams that had been systematically dismantled. She could hear the chatter of pilots preparing for their missions, their voices carrying the confidence of people who knew their value was measured in the precision of their skills and the importance of their objectives. Tech Sergeant Kevin Brooks was waiting for her at the duty desk, his thick frame filling out his uniform in a way that suggested he spent more time behind a desk than on patrol. At 38, he carried himself with the casual authority of someone who had found his niche in the military bureaucracy and had no intention of climbing any higher. His graying mustache twitched with barely concealed irritation as he looked up from his assignment roster. "Mitchell," he said without looking up from his paperwork, "you're on Gate 3 today. Again, try not to let any terrorists slip past while you're daydreaming about whatever it is you daydream about." The comment was delivered with the casual cruelty that had become routine over the past 14 months. Brooks had perfected the art of the professional insult, the kind of remark that stayed just within the boundaries of acceptable military banter while carrying enough venom to remind everyone exactly where they stood in the hierarchy. Sarah had learned not to respond to these verbal jabs, understanding that any reaction would only provide ammunition for future attacks. She nodded once and reached for her duty belt, checking the equipment that had become as familiar as breathing. Radio, flashlight, handcuffs, and the M9 pistol that she was authorized to carry, but had never been allowed to use for anything more challenging than qualifying at the range twice a year. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was trusted to guard one of the most sensitive military installations in the country, while being considered fundamentally inadequate for any role that might actually utilize her training. "Oh, and Mitchell," Brooks continued as she prepared to leave, "Major Williams wants to see the patrol logs from last week. Apparently, there were some discrepancies in your reports." Again, Sarah paused at the door, feeling the familiar knot of frustration tighten in her stomach. Her patrol reports were meticulous, detailed to the point where other guards often complained about having to maintain the same standard when they took over her shifts. If there were discrepancies, they weren't coming from carelessness or incompetence. They were coming from the fact that she noticed things other people missed, Recorded details that seemed irrelevant until they suddenly weren't. What kind of discrepancies, Sergeant? Brooks shrugged with exaggerated indifference. Something about unusual vehicle patterns near the eastern perimeter. Civilian contractors showing up at odd hours. You know, the kind of stuff that sounds important until you realize it's probably just you making something out of nothing, like always. The dismissal stung because Sarah knew her observations were accurate. Over the past month, she had documented a pattern of unusual activity around the less monitored sections of the base perimeter. Vehicles that didn't match the standard contractor profiles, personnel who seemed more interested in the base layout than their supposed maintenance duties, and equipment deliveries that didn't correspond to any scheduled construction or repair projects. Each incident by itself could be explained away as routine business, but together they painted a picture that made her increasingly uneasy. What Brooks and the other security personnel didn't know, what nobody at Riverside Air Force Base knew, was that Sarah Mitchell had once been considered one of the most promising precision marksmen in the United States Air Force before her assignment to base security, before the humiliation and professional exile that had defined the past 14 months. She had trained under Master Sergeant Rodriguez at the Air Force Special Operations Command. Rodriguez was a legend in sniper circles, a man who had trained fewer than 20 students in his entire career and whose graduates were among the most elite marksmen in the military. For 3 years, Sarah had been his final protege, learning techniques that most snipers never heard of, much less mastered. She had spent countless hours on ranges that stretched beyond the horizon, perfecting shots that defied conventional understanding of ballistics and atmospheric conditions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rodriguez had taught her to think like the bullet itself, to understand wind patterns and thermal layers with mathematical precision, to make calculations that turned impossible shots into foregone conclusions. But that was before the incident. At Nellis Air Force Base, before Captain Anderson had decided that her exceptional scores during sniper qualification were somehow suspicious. Before the formal review that had questioned not her accuracy but her methods, suggesting that anyone who could consistently outperform male counterparts with years more experience must be receiving unauthorized assistance or utilizing unorthodox techniques that violated proper protocol. The official report had been carefully worded to avoid direct accusations of cheating while making it clear that her performance was considered anomalous and potentially problematic. Instead of investigating the possibility that she might simply be exceptionally gifted, the review board had chosen to interpret her success as evidence of irregularities that needed to be corrected. Her sniper certification had been suspended, pending further investigation, an investigation that had somehow never materialized despite her repeated requests for clarification. Now she spent her days checking identification cards and walking perimeter fences, her precision rifle skills relegated to distant memory while less qualified personnel filled roles she could have performed with distinction. The military had decided she was more suitable for routine security work, and 14 months of bureaucratic inertia had made that assessment feel permanent. Gate 3 was positioned at the eastern entrance to the base, a checkpoint that primarily served contractor traffic and supply deliveries. It was considered the least important of the base's security positions, which was exactly why Sarah was usually assigned there. The morning routine was predictable: verify credentials, inspect vehicles when required, and maintain detailed logs of all traffic patterns. It was work that could be performed by someone with minimal training, which made it perfect punishment for an airman whose actual capabilities were considered irrelevant. The guard shack at Gate 3 was barely large enough for one person, equipped with basic communication equipment and a computer terminal that connected to the base security network. Sarah settled into her chair and began reviewing the night. Shift reports, noting the usual pattern of early morning deliveries and contractor arrivals. Everything appeared routine, which somehow made her more suspicious rather than less. At 0847 hours, a white panel van approached the gate displaying contractor credentials for Henderson Electronics, a company that supposedly provided maintenance services for the base communication systems. The driver presented identification that matched the work order in the computer system, and the vehicle passed the standard inspection protocol without raising any obvious red flags. But something about the interaction felt wrong in a way that Sarah couldn't immediately articulate. The driver had been professionally courteous but had avoided making direct eye contact, which was unusual for someone in a customer service role. His identification photo looked recent, but his tan suggested someone who spent significant time outdoors rather than working on indoor electronic systems. Most telling was his reaction when she asked about the specific systems he would be servicing. That day, his answer had been technically correct, but delivered with the careful precision of someone reciting memorized information rather than discussing familiar work. Sarah made detailed notes about the interaction, including her observations about the driver's behavior and the discrepancies she had noticed. She knew that Brooks would probably dismiss her concerns as paranoia, but she had learned to trust her instincts even when others questioned them. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had taught her that the most important skill for any precision marksman was the ability to notice details that others missed, to see patterns where others saw randomness. The morning continued with routine traffic, but Sarah found herself paying closer attention to patterns that had previously seemed unremarkable. She noticed that Henderson Electronics had been making deliveries to the base with unusual frequency. Over the past month, always during shifts when she was on duty, she realized that their work orders consistently listed maintenance on communication systems that were located in areas with excellent sight lines to the main runway and aircraft parking areas. By 1200 hours, Sarah had documented enough observations to justify a more detailed report. The pattern of contractor activity around the eastern perimeter was becoming increasingly suspicious when viewed as a coordinated effort rather than isolated incidents. Someone was conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance of the base's most sensitive areas while hiding behind legitimate maintenance contracts and properly executed paperwork. The lunch hour brought a temporary lull in traffic, giving Sarah time to review security footage from previous shifts. The base security system allowed guards to access archived video from their assigned gates, ostensibly to help with incident reports and traffic analysis. What Sarah discovered as she reviewed the footage made her blood run cold. The Henderson Electronics van had appeared at Gate 317 times over the past 6 weeks, always with different drivers but following similar patterns. Each visit had lasted exactly long enough to service the communication equipment listed in their work orders, but the drivers had consistently taken indirect routes to their assigned locations. Instead of proceeding directly to their destinations, they had made unnecessary detours that provided them with comprehensive views of aircraft positions, security camera locations, and personnel movement patterns. More disturbing was the realization that these reconnaissance missions were being conducted with military precision. The timing of visits corresponded to periods when specific aircraft were scheduled for maintenance or training exercises. The routes taken by the contractors provided them with detailed intelligence about security gaps and surveillance blind spots. Someone was mapping Riverside Air Force Base with the thoroughness of an organization, planning something far more serious than communication system maintenance. Sarah's training kicked in as she began analyzing the intelligence she had gathered. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to gather intelligence about base operations, security procedures, and aircraft capabilities. The level of planning and execution indicated professional operatives rather than opportunistic criminals. This was the kind of systematic reconnaissance that preceded major security breaches or terrorist attacks. The implications were staggering. Riverside Air Force Base was home to the 432nd Wing, which operated some of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the United States inventory. The base stored millions of dollars worth of sensitive equipment and housed classified operations that were critical to national security. If hostile operatives had been conducting surveillance for 6 weeks, they potentially had enough intelligence to plan an attack that could cripple American air power in the region. Sarah reached for her radio to contact the Security Forces Operations Center, then hesitated. Her previous attempts to report suspicious activity had been dismissed as overreaction by personnel who viewed her as an unreliable source of intelligence. Brooks had made it clear that her observations were considered suspect, and Major Williams had shown no interest in her detailed reports about unusual contractor activity. But this was different. This wasn't a single suspicious incident or a gut feeling about unusual behavior. This was documented evidence of coordinated reconnaissance activity that posed a direct threat to base security. She had video footage, detailed logs, and a pattern of behavior that any competent intelligence analyst would recognize as hostile surveillance. The radio crackled to life before she could make her decision. Gate 3, this is operations. B. Advised we have a priority delivery scheduled for 13:30 hours. Henderson Electronics van. Driver identification Baker. Expected duration 90 minutes for communication system upgrades in Building 47. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. Building 47 housed the base's primary communication hub, the Nerve Center that coordinated all air traffic control and combat operations. It was also located adjacent to the aircraft maintenance hangars, where the most sensitive aircraft were serviced. A 90-minute window in that location would provide hostile operatives with access to classified communication protocols and detailed intelligence about aircraft capabilities. Operations. This is Gate 3, Sarah replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Request clarification on the work order details for Henderson Electronics. I need to verify the scope of authorized access. The response came back with irritation that was audible even through the radio static. Gate 3. The work order has been properly authorized and processed through normal channels. Your job is to verify credentials and log traffic, not to second-guess. Approved contractors. The dismissal was exactly what Sarah had expected, but it confirmed her worst fears. Hostile operatives had infiltrated the base security approval process, using legitimate paperwork to gain access to sensitive areas. The Henderson Electronics van approaching her gate wasn't just another reconnaissance mission. It was the beginning of an operation that could compromise national security and potentially cost the lives of every airman on the base. At 13:27 hours, the white van appeared at the end of the access road, moving at a speed that suggested urgency rather than routine. Maintenance. Sarah could see 2 occupants in the front seats, both wearing the kind of contractor uniforms that could be purchased at any military surplus store. The vehicle's license plates matched the information in her computer system and the work order. Documentation appeared to be properly executed and authorized. But Sarah's training had taught her to look beyond surface appearances. The van was riding lower than it should for a vehicle carrying standard electronic equipment, suggesting additional weight that wasn't accounted for in the manifest. The driver's window was tinted darker than regulation standards, making it difficult to verify the occupant's identity before the vehicle reached the checkpoint. Most importantly, the van's approach pattern followed a route that avoided the main base traffic areas, suggesting the occupants wanted to minimize their exposure to security cameras and personnel. As the van pulled up to her checkpoint, Sarah made a decision that would either save hundreds of lives or destroy what remained of her military career. Instead of following standard protocol and waving the properly credentialed contractor through the gate, she activated the vehicle inspection procedures that required the occupants to exit the van while she conducted a detailed search. Good afternoon, she said to the driver as he rolled down his window. I need you and your passenger to step out of the vehicle for routine inspection." The driver's reaction confirmed her suspicions. Instead of the mild annoyance typical of contractors facing unexpected delays, his expression showed the controlled tension of someone whose carefully planned operation had just encountered an unwelcome complication. His passenger remained motionless, staring straight ahead with the rigid posture of someone trying very hard to appear relaxed. "Is there a problem, officer?" the driver asked, his accent carrying the faint traces of training that had attempted to eliminate regional inflections. "Our work order shows standard access authorization for Building 47. We're already running behind schedule." Sarah noted the subtle pressure tactic, the suggestion that any delay would be her fault rather than a necessary security procedure. It was exactly the kind of manipulation that worked on guards who were more concerned about avoiding complaints than maintaining security standards. Unfortunately for the van's occupants, they were dealing with someone whose training had prepared her to recognize and resist such techniques. "Standard inspection procedure, sir," she replied calmly while activating the silent alarm that would alert operations to a potential security situation. "Please step out of the vehicle and present your identification." The driver exchanged a quick glance with his passenger, a communication that lasted barely a second, but conveyed volumes about their true intentions. Sarah recognized the look from her tactical training. These weren't maintenance workers dealing with bureaucratic delays. These were operatives whose mission had just been compromised by an unexpectedly thorough security guard. As the driver slowly opened his door, Sarah noticed the bulge under his jacket that suggested concealed body armor rather than electronic repair tools. His movements were too controlled, too precise for someone in a civilian maintenance role. When he handed her his identification, she noted that his hands showed the calluses typical of someone who spent considerable time handling weapons rather than delicate electronic equipment. The identification appeared legitimate at first glance, but Sarah's training had taught her to look for subtle indicators of forged documents. The lamination was slightly too perfect. The photograph's color saturation didn't quite match authentic government-issued credentials, and the magnetic strip showed wear patterns inconsistent with genuine contractor badges that were replaced regularly. "Sir, I need you to open the rear doors of your vehicle for inspection," Sarah said, maintaining the professional courtesy required by protocol while preparing for the possibility that this routine procedure was about to become significantly more dangerous. The driver hesitated for just a moment too long, his eyes flicking toward his passenger before returning to meet her gaze. "Officer, we're carrying sensitive electronic equipment that could be damaged by unauthorized handling. Perhaps you could contact your supervisor to verify that this level of inspection is really necessary." It was another pressure tactic, an attempt to make her doubt her authority while buying time for whatever backup plan they were implementing. Sarah could see the passenger reaching slowly towards something inside his jacket, a movement that was carefully casual but unmistakably purposeful. Her tactical training screamed warnings about imminent threat situations and the need to take decisive action before hostile operatives could implement whatever contingency they had prepared. "Sir, I need you to keep your hands visible and step away from the vehicle," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority she had learned during her previous career as a precision marksman. "Your passenger needs to exit the vehicle immediately." With his hands in plain sight, the transformation in both men was instantaneous and terrifying. The careful facade of civilian contractors disappeared, replaced by the controlled aggression of professional operatives whose cover had been blown. The driver's hand moved toward his concealed weapon while his passenger began to emerge from the van with obvious hostile intent. Sarah's world slowed to the crystalline clarity that Master Sergeant Rodriguez had taught her to recognize as the transition from normal awareness to combat consciousness. Every detail became hyper-real, the driver's hand closing around the grip of his concealed pistol, the passenger's foot touching the asphalt as he prepared to spring from the vehicle, The distant sound of aircraft engines that represented hundreds of American airmen whose lives now depended on her ability to respond to an evolving threat situation. 14 months of professional humiliation and bureaucratic dismissal fell away as Sarah Mitchell remembered exactly who she had been before the system decided she was expendable. Her hand moved to her sidearm with the fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory had been forged through thousands of hours of training under the most demanding instructor in the United States Air Force. Confrontation at Gate 3 was about to escalate from routine security procedure to life or death combat, and the outcome would determine whether Riverside Air Force Base remained an operational military installation or became the site of the most devastating terrorist attack on American soil since September 11th. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, Sarah Mitchell was about to remember what it felt like to be the most dangerous person within a 1,000-mile radius, regardless of what her current job description might suggest. The radio on her belt crackled with routine traffic from other security positions, completely unaware that World War III was about to begin at an unmanned gate on the eastern perimeter of a base that most people had never heard of. In approximately 30 seconds, a former sniper who had been relegated to checking identification cards was going to prove that bureaucratic incompetence couldn't eliminate natural talent, only temporarily hide it. The Henderson Electronics van contained enough explosives to level half the base and enough small arms ammunition to sustain a prolonged assault on critical infrastructure. The two operatives had spent 6 weeks gathering intelligence and were prepared to sacrifice their lives to cripple American air power in the region. They had planned for every contingency except the possibility that their final checkpoint would be staffed by someone whose skills far exceeded their intelligence estimates. Sarah Mitchell was about to remind everyone involved why Master Sergeant Rodriguez had once told his superiors that training her was the most important thing he had ever done for American national security. The bureaucrats who had buried her career were about to discover that excellence has a way of surfacing when the stakes become high enough. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of approaching storm clouds and the promise of violence that would either save hundreds of lives or mark the beginning of a catastrophe that would reshape American military policy forever. At Gate 3 on the eastern perimeter of Riverside Air Force Base, the future of American air power was about to be decided by a security guard whose true capabilities had been systematically ignored for 14 months. The irony would have been amusing if the consequences weren't so potentially devastating. The first gunshot shattered the afternoon silence with the sharp crack of professional weaponry. Sarah had drawn and fired her M9 pistol in one fluid motion, the muscle memory of countless training sessions overriding 14 months of bureaucratic suppression. Her bullet caught the driver's center mass just as his own weapon cleared its concealment, sending him spinning backward against the van's open door in a spray of blood and surprise. The passenger was already moving, rolling out of the vehicle with the practiced grace of someone who had trained for exactly this scenario. His assault rifle appeared in his hands as if materialized from thin air, the black metal gleaming with the oiled precision of a weapon that had seen recent combat. Sarah dove behind the concrete barrier that separated the guard shack from the vehicle inspection area, feeling the supersonic crack of bullets pass through the space where she had been standing milliseconds before. Her radio was screaming with confused chatter as security personnel across the base tried to understand what was happening at Gate 3. The automated systems had detected gunfire and were already initiating lockdown protocols, but Sarah knew that help was at least 5 minutes away. 5 minutes was an eternity when facing a trained operative with superior firepower and tactical positioning. The passenger had taken cover behind the van's engine block, using the vehicle's mass to shield himself while maintaining clear lines of fire toward her position. Sarah could hear him speaking rapidly in a language she didn't recognize, probably communicating with backup units or coordinating with other elements of whatever operation was now unfolding. The professional calm in his voice suggested this wasn't his first firefight, and the tactical discipline of his positioning indicated military training that rivaled her own. Sarah assessed her situation with the clinical detachment that Master Sergeant Rodriguez had drilled into her during survival training. She had 15 rounds remaining in her pistol, minimal cover, and an opponent who possessed superior firepower and tactical advantage. Under normal circumstances, the smart move would be to maintain defensive positioning and wait for backup. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Sarah was beginning to remember that she had never been a normal soldier. The van's rear doors had swung open during the initial exchange of gunfire, revealing cargo that made Sarah's blood freeze. Military-grade explosives were packed in carefully organized rows, enough C4 to level multiple buildings and kill hundreds of people. Detonation equipment was visible among the ordnance, suggesting that the operatives had been prepared to trigger their payload remotely if their infiltration mission was compromised. More disturbing were the detailed maps and photographs scattered across the van's floor. Satellite images of the base showed aircraft positions, security camera locations, and personnel movement patterns marked with the precision of a military targeting package. Building schematics revealed structural weak points and optimal explosive placement for maximum damage. This wasn't a random terrorist attack or opportunistic sabotage. This was a precisely planned military operation designed to cripple American air power with surgical efficiency. The passenger fired another burst that sent concrete fragments exploding around Sarah's position. His marksmanship was excellent, each shot placed with the accuracy of someone who understood ballistics and tactical geometry. But Sarah noticed something in his firing pattern that gave her the first tactical advantage she had gained since the confrontation began. He was shooting like someone trained in urban combat environments, where engagement ranges were measured in dozens of meters rather than hundreds. Sarah's training had been fundamentally different. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had taught her to think in terms of precision rather than volume, to make every shot count rather than relying on suppressive fire. The passenger was fighting like an assault trooper, which meant he was probably unprepared for the kind of precision marksmanship that could reach out and touch him from ranges he considered safe. The guard shack behind her contained equipment that most security personnel never had occasion to use. Emergency protocols required each gate to maintain backup weapons and ammunition for situations where standard sidearms proved inadequate. Sarah had memorized the location of every piece of equipment during her first week at Gate 3. Understanding that thorough preparation was the difference between competent soldiers and dead ones. She low-crawled toward the rear of the guard shack, using the concrete structure to mask her movement, while the passenger continued to hammer her previous position with accurate fire. The backup weapons locker was secured with a combination lock that she had observed Brooks open dozens of times during routine inspections. Military personnel were notoriously predictable when choosing security codes, and Brooks had proven no exception to that rule. The locker contained an M4 carbine with attached scope, exactly the kind of precision weapon that Sarah had trained with for 3 years under Rodriguez's demanding instruction. 200 rounds of match-grade ammunition were stored in loaded magazines, enough firepower to engage multiple targets at extended range. As her hands closed around the familiar weight of a precision rifle, Sarah felt the final vestiges of her imposed limitations fall away like discarded armor. Through the scope, the tactical situation became crystal clear. The passenger had repositioned himself to maintain covering fire while advancing toward the guard shack, using textbook urban assault tactics to close the distance between them. His movement was professional and disciplined, but it was also predictable to someone who understood how assault troops were trained to think. Sarah had a clear shot at 400 meters through the gap between the van and the perimeter fence. It was an easy shot for someone with her training, well within the capabilities of the equipment she was using. but it required her to expose herself to return fire while taking aim. The passenger would have approximately 2 seconds to acquire and engage her before she could complete her shot, assuming he noticed her repositioning at all. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had taught her that the difference between good snipers and great ones wasn't accuracy or equipment quality. It was the ability to make perfect shots under imperfect conditions, while hostile forces were actively trying to kill them. Sarah controlled her breathing, steadied her heartbeat, and prepared to find out whether 14 months of bureaucratic humiliation had dulled the skills that had once made her Rodriguez's most promising student. The shot was almost anticlimactic. Sarah's bullet caught the passenger in the upper torso just as he emerged from cover to advance on her position. The 5.56mm round traveled the 400 meters in less than half a second, striking with the devastating precision that separated military marksmen from casual shooters. The operative collapsed immediately, his assault rifle clattering across the asphalt as his carefully planned attack became a casualty of superior training and tactical patience. Silence settled over Gate 3 like a blanket, broken only by the distant sound of approaching sirens as base security finally responded to the automated alerts. Sarah maintained her firing position, scanning for additional threats while her mind processed the implications of what had just occurred. 2 hostile operatives were dead. Their vehicle contained enough explosives to devastate the base, and their intelligence materials suggested a coordinated attack that probably involved multiple teams. The radio crackled with urgent communications as Major Williams attempted to coordinate the base's response to an unprecedented security breach. Sarah could hear the confusion in his voice as he tried to understand how a routine gate inspection had escalated into a firefight that left 2 suspected terrorists dead and exposed what appeared to be a major plot against American military assets. Security vehicles were converging on Gate 3 from multiple directions, their emergency lights painting the desert landscape in alternating red and blue patterns. Sarah could see personnel moving with the urgent efficiency of soldiers, responding to a genuine crisis rather than a training exercise. Within minutes, the quiet Eastern Gate would be swarming with investigators, explosives experts, and intelligence personnel trying to piece together the scope of the threat she had just neutralized. But Sarah's tactical assessment suggested that the immediate threat was far from over. Professional operatives didn't work alone, and the level of planning evident in the van's contents indicated a complex operation with multiple contingencies. The Henderson electronic surveillance had been ongoing for 6 weeks, providing hostile forces with detailed intelligence about base operations and security procedures. 2 dead operatives meant that somewhere else on the base, backup teams were probably implementing alternative plans that accounted for the possibility of their primary assault being detected. The first security vehicle to reach Gate 3 was driven by Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, a competent military police officer who had always treated Sarah with professional courtesy despite the institutional prejudice that defined most interactions. At Riverside, Walsh emerged from her vehicle with her weapon drawn, scanning for threats while processing the scene of destruction that had transformed the quiet Eastern Gate into a combat zone. "Mitchell, what the hell happened here?" Walsh called out, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone trying to maintain operational awareness while dealing with circumstances that exceeded her training and experience. Sarah lowered her rifle but maintained her tactical position, understanding that the situation remained potentially dangerous until explosive ordnance disposal personnel could secure the van's payload. 2 hostile operatives attempted to infiltrate the base using fraudulent contractor credentials. They were armed with military weapons and carrying enough explosives to level half the installation. Walsh approached the van cautiously, her expression growing increasingly grim as she observed the organized explosives and detailed intelligence materials scattered throughout the cargo area. "Jesus Christ, Mitchell, how did you know they were hostile?" Their paperwork showed proper authorization through normal channels. The question cut to the heart of everything that had gone wrong with Sarah's military career. Her ability to notice details that others missed, to recognize patterns that seemed invisible to conventionally trained personnel, had been systematically dismissed as paranoia or overreaction. Now those same analytical skills had prevented what could have been the most devastating attack on American soil since the World Trade Center. "I've been tracking unusual contractor activity for 6 weeks," Sarah replied, maintaining her observation of the surrounding area while more security vehicles arrived. "Henderson Electronics has been conducting systematic reconnaissance of base operations under the cover of legitimate maintenance contracts. Their movement patterns and equipment access suggested intelligence gathering rather than routine repairs." Walsh was quiet for a moment, studying the evidence that supported Sarah's assessment. The maps and photographs in the van clearly showed detailed surveillance of sensitive areas, marked with the kind of tactical analysis that preceded major military operations. The explosives were arranged with professional precision, suggesting operatives with extensive training in demolitions and structural engineering. "Why didn't you report this through normal channels?" Walsh asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Sarah almost laughed at the question. For 6 weeks, she had submitted detailed reports about suspicious contractor activity. Each report had been dismissed as the overcautious observations of a security guard whose judgment was considered fundamentally unreliable. Brooks had made it clear that her analytical assessments were unwelcome, and Major Williams had shown no interest in investigating patterns that didn't conform to his expectations about base security threats. "I submitted 14 separate reports documenting suspicious activity," Sarah replied. "They were classified as routine observations and filed without investigation. Apparently, my analytical assessments were considered paranoid overreaction by personnel who preferred simpler explanations." The irony was staggering. The same analytical skills that had made her an exceptional sniper candidate had been dismissed as problematic when applied to security work. The institution that had trained her to notice minute details and recognize subtle patterns had decided that those abilities were somehow inappropriate when exercised by someone assigned to base security duties. Major Williams arrived in a convoy of command vehicles, his face showing the controlled panic of someone whose career was about to be defined by how well he managed an unprecedented crisis. At 42, Williams had built his reputation on maintaining smooth operations and avoiding situations that attracted unwanted attention from higher command levels. The sight of 2 dead operatives and enough explosives to devastate his installation represented exactly the kind of career-defining disaster that competent officers spent their entire service trying to avoid. "Sergeant Mitchell," Williams said, as he approached, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who wasn't sure whether he was addressing a hero or a problem that needed to be contained. "I need you to walk me through exactly what happened here." Sarah provided a precise chronological account of the confrontation, from her initial suspicions about the van's occupants through the tactical engagement that had ended with 2 dead operatives and the discovery of their explosive payload. She emphasized the pattern of reconnaissance activity that had preceded the attack, the sophisticated planning evident in their intelligence materials, and the likelihood that additional teams were operating elsewhere on the base. Williams listened, with the growing realization that his installation had been under systematic surveillance for weeks without his knowledge. The security protocols he had considered adequate were revealed as fundamentally inadequate when faced with professional operatives who understood how to exploit bureaucratic blindness and institutional complacency. "Sergeant, you mentioned submitting reports about suspicious contractor activity. I don't recall seeing any intelligence assessments that suggested coordinated surveillance operations." Sarah met his gaze directly, understanding that her answer would determine whether the institutional failures that had enabled this attack would be acknowledged or buried under layers of bureaucratic denial. Sir, I submitted 14 reports, documenting unusual patterns in contractor access and movement. They were dismissed as routine observations by security forces personnel who considered my analytical assessments unreliable. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the recent gunfire. Williams was being forced to confront the possibility that his command's security had been compromised, not by sophisticated enemy action, but by institutional prejudice that had prevented qualified personnel from performing their assigned duties effectively. Explosives ordnance disposal personnel arrived and began the delicate process of securing the van's payload, while intelligence specialists started photographing and cataloging the surveillance materials that revealed the scope of hostile reconnaissance. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Riverside Air Force Base had been targeted for a devastating attack that had been prevented only by the tactical skills of a security guard whose capabilities had been systematically underestimated. Technical Sergeant Robert Kim from the Base Intelligence Section approached with a tablet computer containing preliminary analysis of the materials found in the van. Kim was a competent analyst whose work Sarah had always respected, even though their professional interactions had been limited by her assignment to routine security duties. "Sergeant Mitchell," Kim said, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who had discovered information that changed everything about their operational assumptions. "These surveillance materials show intelligence gathering that goes far beyond what two operatives could have accomplished independently. We're looking at a coordinated effort involving multiple teams and extensive resources." The tablet displayed satellite photographs that had been annotated with tactical markings showing aircraft positions, security camera coverage, and personnel movement patterns. The level of detail suggested surveillance operations that had been ongoing for months rather than weeks, involving resources that exceeded anything available to conventional terrorist organizations. "Sir," Sarah said, addressing Major Williams directly, "the Henderson Electronics reconnaissance was just the final phase of intelligence gathering. Someone has been mapping this base with the thoroughness of a military targeting operation. The operatives I engaged were probably part of an assault team whose mission was to destroy specific aircraft and facilities based on months of detailed surveillance." Williams studied the evidence with the growing understanding that his installation faced threats that exceeded anything covered in standard security protocols. The sophistication of the intelligence material suggested state-sponsored operations rather than independent terrorist activities. Someone with significant resources and professional military capabilities had decided that Riverside Air Force Base was a target worth destroying. "Sergeant Kim," Williams said, his voice carrying the authority of someone making decisions that would define his remaining military career, "I want a complete analysis of all contractor activity on this base for the past 6 months. Cross-reference every work order with personnel, background checks, and verify the authenticity of every company that has accessed sensitive areas." Kim nodded, understanding that his analysis would probably reveal security breaches that went far beyond the Henderson Electronics operation. "Sir, based on the intelligence materials we've recovered, I recommend implementing immediate lockdown procedures and conducting sweeps for additional explosive devices. If they manage to place surveillance equipment, they might have also pre-positioned weapons or ordnance." The implications were terrifying. Professional operatives with months of access to the base could have planted explosives in locations that would maximize damage to critical infrastructure. Aircraft hangars, fuel storage facilities, and communication centers could already be rigged for destruction, waiting for remote detonation signals that would coordinate with the assault that Sarah had just prevented. Sarah's radio crackled with urgent communications from other security positions around the base perimeter. Gate 7 reported suspicious activity involving a catering truck that had deviated from its authorized route. Gate 1 documented unusual behavior by maintenance personnel who were asking questions about aircraft schedules and security procedures. The pattern was becoming clear. The Henderson electronics operation had been part of a coordinated assault involving multiple infiltration teams positioned around the entire installation. "Major," Sarah said, her voice carrying the urgency of someone whose tactical assessment was painting an increasingly dangerous picture. "We need to assume that additional operatives are already inside the base perimeter. The surveillance materials show intelligence that could only have been gathered through extended access to sensitive areas. There are probably backup teams implementing alternative plans right now." Williams was beginning to understand the scope of the crisis he was facing. His base wasn't dealing with a single failed infiltration attempt. They were facing a coordinated military operation that had been planned with the kind of resources and sophistication that suggested foreign intelligence services rather than conventional terrorist organizations. The sound of aircraft engines filled the air as F-16 fighters began emergency takeoff procedures, removing valuable assets from potential ground-based attacks while providing air cover for base security operations. The sight of combat aircraft launching from their home base in response to hostile action was surreal, like watching a training exercise transform into actual warfare. Staff Sergeant Walsh approached with additional intelligence that confirmed Sarah's assessment about the scope of the threat they were facing. "Sir, we've identified 3 additional vehicles on base that match the profiles documented in the surveillance materials. All are positioned near critical infrastructure, and none of their occupants can be located through normal communication channels." The tactical situation was evolving rapidly from a single security incident to a base-wide emergency that threatened hundreds of lives and millions of dollars worth of sensitive military equipment. Sarah found herself at the center of response operations, her analytical skills and tactical expertise suddenly invaluable to commanders who had previously dismissed her capabilities as irrelevant. Major Williams turned to Sarah with the expression of someone who was being forced to confront fundamental assumptions about personnel evaluation and tactical preparedness. "Sergeant Mitchell, I need your assessment of our current tactical situation and recommendations for immediate response priorities." The question represented a complete reversal of the institutional dynamics that had defined Sarah's military experience for the past 14 months. The same analytical capabilities that had been dismissed as paranoid overreaction were now being requested by the base commander as essential intelligence for managing an unprecedented crisis. Sarah consulted the tactical display that intelligence personnel had constructed from the recovered surveillance materials, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities that had been exploited by hostile operatives over months of careful planning. Her assessment was professionally devastating and personally vindicating in equal measure. "Sir, based on the intelligence materials and observed activity patterns, we're facing a coordinated assault designed to cripple base operations through simultaneous attacks on aircraft, fuel storage, and communication facilities. The operatives have had months to pre-position equipment and personnel. Our immediate priority should be aircraft evacuation, explosive ordnance disposal sweeps, and tactical teams to neutralize remaining infiltrators." Williams nodded, understanding that his installation survival depended on implementing Sarah's recommendations with the speed and precision that the situation demanded. The irony wasn't lost on him that the security guard whose capabilities he had ignored was now providing tactical analysis that would determine whether Riverside Air Force Base remained operational or became a monument to institutional failure. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over the Nevada desert, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But beauty was a luxury that nobody at Riverside Air Force Base could afford while hostile operatives with military-grade explosives remained at large within their perimeter. Sarah checked her rifle and prepared for the possibility that her Confrontation at Gate 3 had been only the opening engagement of a battle that would determine whether American air power in the region survived the next few hours. The war against institutional prejudice had been won, but the war against actual enemies was just beginning. The radio crackled with reports of explosions near Building 47, the communication hub that the Henderson Electronics operatives had been scheduled to access. The battle for Riverside Air Force Base had begun in earnest, and the outcome would depend on whether a former sniper candidate could translate her tactical skills into mission success under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Everything Sarah had trained for, everything she had been denied the opportunity to prove, was about to be tested in combat conditions that would either validate her capabilities or prove that institutional assessments about her limitations had been correct. All along, the desert wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of distant explosions and the promise that the next few hours would determine whether Sarah Mitchell was truly the elite operative that Master Sergeant Rodriguez had trained, or just another security guard who had gotten lucky during a single tactical engagement. Time would tell, but time was running out faster than anyone at Riverside Air Force Base could afford. The explosions at Building 47 sent shockwaves across the base that rattled windows and set off car alarms in the parking areas. Sarah watched through her rifle scope as smoke billowed from the communication hub, the black clouds rising against the desert sky like a funeral pyre for American air superiority. The Henderson Electronics operatives had succeeded in their backup plan, using remotely detonated charges to cripple the base's primary coordination center, just as tactical teams were beginning to respond to the broader threat. Major Williams was shouting orders into multiple radios, trying to coordinate emergency response while establishing backup communication protocols that would allow continued operations. The destruction of Building 47 had effectively blinded the base to incoming threats while disrupting the command structure needed to mount an effective defense. Sarah could hear the frustration in his voice as he struggled to manage a crisis that exceeded every contingency plan in the standard operating procedures. Technical Sergeant Kim approached with a handheld radio and grim expression that suggested the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. "Sir, we've lost contact with Gates 5 and 7. Their automated systems show green status, but personnel aren't responding to radio calls. We also have unconfirmed reports of gunfire near the aircraft maintenance hangars." The tactical picture was becoming increasingly clear to Sarah, even as it remained confusing to personnel who lacked her training in asymmetric warfare analysis. The hostile operatives were implementing a coordinated assault designed to isolate and neutralize defensive positions while maintaining the element of surprise. The explosion at Building 47 had been timed to coincide with attacks on other critical infrastructure, creating multiple simultaneous crises that would overwhelm the base's ability to respond effectively. Sarah studied the tactical display that intelligence personnel had constructed from recovered surveillance materials, noting the precise positioning of targets that had been selected for maximum operational impact. The enemy planners understood American military doctrine well enough to predict how Riverside would respond to various threat scenarios, and they had positioned their assets to exploit those predictable reactions. "Major," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the command post that had been hastily established in the security forces building. "They're not trying to destroy the base. They're trying to capture it intact." Williams turned from his radio communications with the expression of someone whose assumptions about enemy objectives were being fundamentally challenged. "What do you mean, Sergeant?" Sarah pointed to specific targets marked on the surveillance maps, highlighting a pattern that became obvious once someone understood how to interpret tactical intelligence. "The explosions are designed to disable communication and coordination capabilities without damaging aircraft or critical infrastructure. They want to neutralize our ability to respond while preserving the assets they're trying to capture." The implications were staggering. Instead of facing a terrorist attack designed to maximize destruction and casualties, Riverside Air Force Base was being subjected to a military operation aimed at seizing control of advanced American aircraft and sensitive technology, the F-16. Fighters housed at the base represented hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cutting-edge military hardware that would be invaluable to hostile foreign powers. Kim consulted his intelligence analysis with growing understanding of the sophisticated planning that had made such an audacious operation possible. Sir, if they're attempting to capture rather than destroy, they probably have extraction plans that involve getting stolen aircraft off American soil before we can mount an effective pursuit. Sarah nodded, her tactical assessment confirming Kim's analysis while adding details that painted an even more disturbing picture. The surveillance materials showed detailed study of our flight schedules and maintenance rotations. They know exactly which aircraft are flight-ready and which pilots are on duty. This isn't opportunistic theft. This is a planned acquisition of specific military assets. The radio crackled with urgent communications from the air traffic control tower, where personnel were reporting unusual activity on the main runway. Unidentified vehicles were positioning themselves near aircraft parking areas, and several F-16s were showing signs of unauthorized maintenance activity that didn't correspond to any scheduled operations. Williams grabbed the radio with the desperation of someone whose command was disintegrating in real time. Tower, this is base command. Are you reporting hostile activity near aircraft positions? The response came back through static that suggested communication equipment was being systematically jammed or disrupted. Base command, we have multiple vehicles surrounding Hangar Complex Alpha. Personnel in flight suits are conducting pre-flight procedures on aircraft that weren't scheduled for operations. Unable to establish radio contact with maintenance crews. Sarah felt the familiar clarity of tactical analysis cutting through the confusion that paralyzed conventional military thinking. The enemy operatives weren't just stealing aircraft. They were preparing to fly them off the base using procedures and protocols that had been studied through months of surveillance. Someone with extensive knowledge of American flight operations was coordinating a theft operation that would strip Riverside of its entire fighter capability. Major, we need to assume that hostile operatives have infiltrated the base personnel, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose previous assessments had been proven catastrophically accurate. The level of operational knowledge they're demonstrating suggests inside assistants or compromised personnel who are actively supporting the theft operation. Williams stared at her with the expression of someone whose world was collapsing in ways that exceeded his worst nightmares. The possibility that American military personnel were actively collaborating with hostile forces represented a security breach that went beyond operational failure into the realm of treason and institutional catastrophe. Staff Sergeant Walsh returned from a reconnaissance mission to the main hangar complex with information that confirmed Sarah's assessment about the scope of the threat they were facing. Her face was pale with the shock of someone who had witnessed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about military security and personnel loyalty. Sir, Walsh reported, her voice tight with controlled emotion, I observed what appeared to be base maintenance personnel assisting unknown individuals in aircraft preparation procedures. They were working together with the kind of coordination that suggests long-term planning rather than coerced cooperation. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Not only had hostile operatives successfully infiltrated Riverside Air Force Base, but they had recruited American military personnel to assist in stealing the most advanced fighter aircraft in the United States inventory. The operation represented a level of intelligence penetration that suggested months or years of careful cultivation and recruitment. Sarah's radio buzzed with an incoming transmission on a frequency that wasn't part of standard base communications. The voice that emerged from the static spoke with calm professionalism that was more terrifying. than any amount of shouting or threats could have been. Riverside Base Command, this is Operational Team Leader. We currently control your aircraft maintenance facilities and have prepared 6 F-16 fighters for immediate departure. Any attempt to interfere with our operations will result in the destruction of remaining aircraft and the elimination of captured personnel. Williams grabbed the radio with hands that shook with rage and disbelief. This is Major Williams, Commanding Officer of Riverside Air Force Base. You are engaged in acts of war against the United States. Surrender immediately and you will be treated according to international conventions. The response came back with the kind of amused contempt that suggested the speaker had expected exactly that reaction. Major Williams, we have been monitoring your communications and are aware of your tactical situation. You have lost effective command and control capabilities, and your security forces are insufficient to prevent our departure with the aircraft we have selected. We recommend that you focus on minimizing casualties among your remaining personnel. Sarah studied the tactical display while listening to the exchange, noting patterns in the enemy's positioning and timing that revealed vulnerabilities in their otherwise sophisticated operation. The hostile operatives were executing a complex plan with military precision, but they were also operating under constraints that created opportunities for someone with the right training and tactical perspective. Major, Sarah said quietly, they're making the same mistake that most special operations planners make when conducting complex missions. They're so focused on the primary objective that they're not adequately prepared for sustained defensive operations. Williams turned to her with the desperate hope of someone whose career and possibly his life depended on finding solutions that exceeded conventional military thinking. What do you mean, Sergeant? Sarah pointed to specific locations. On the surveillance maps where enemy positions were marked with tactical symbols. Their positions are optimized for controlling aircraft and personnel, but they're not well positioned for defending against precision fire from elevated positions. They're thinking like thieves rather than soldiers. The analysis was based on principles that Master Sergeant Rodriguez had drilled into her during advanced tactical training. Complex operations required complex logistics and coordination, which created dependencies and vulnerabilities that could be exploited by opponents who understood how to identify and target critical points in the enemy's operational structure. Kim approached with additional intelligence that supported Sarah's assessment, while adding details that made the situation even more urgent. Sir, we've identified the probable extraction route. There's a cargo aircraft on approach to the auxiliary runway that isn't showing up on any flight schedules. Based on its size and approach pattern, it's capable of transporting stolen F-16 components if they disassemble the aircraft for transport. The enemy plan was becoming clear with terrifying precision. The hostile operatives weren't planning to fly the stolen aircraft off American soil, which would have been nearly impossible without being intercepted by air defense systems. Instead, they were preparing to disassemble the fighters and transport them as cargo, probably to a destination where they could be reconstructed and reverse-engineered by foreign intelligence services. Sarah's tactical assessment suggested that the enemy operation was entering its most vulnerable phase. The complexity of disassembling and loading advanced military aircraft would require the operatives to maintain fixed positions for extended periods, which created opportunities for precision engagement by someone with the skills and equipment to exploit those vulnerabilities. Major, I need authorization to take a precision rifle and engage enemy positions from the control tower, Sarah said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone whose previous tactical recommendations had been proven accurate under combat conditions. Williams hesitated, understanding that authorizing a security guard to conduct sniper operations exceeded every protocol in the standard operating procedures. But conventional protocols had already failed catastrophically, and Sarah's analytical capabilities had been the only thing preventing complete disaster. Sergeant, the control tower is over 800 meters from the hangar complex. That's beyond the effective range of standard security weapons. Sarah smiled with the quiet confidence that had once made Master Sergeant Rodriguez proud of his final student. Sir, 800 meters is well within my capabilities. The bigger challenge will be identifying which targets to engage first, to maximize disruption of their operational timeline. The admission revealed the depth of training that had been systematically ignored during 14 months of security guard duties. Williams was beginning to understand that he had been wasting the capabilities of someone whose skills far exceeded anything available to conventional base security personnel. Technical Sergeant Kim consulted his intelligence analysis while studying the tactical options available to them. Sir, if Sergeant Mitchell can disrupt their operational timeline, we might be able to prevent the aircraft theft, even if we can't retake the hangar complex immediately. Sarah was already planning her engagement strategy, identifying targets whose elimination would create maximum disruption to enemy operations while minimizing risk to captured American personnel. The precision marksmanship training that Rodriguez had provided included extensive instruction in tactical target prioritization and sequential engagement planning. I'll need someone to coordinate communications and provide real-time intelligence about enemy movement patterns, Sarah said, her mind already focused on the technical challenges of conducting precision engagements under combat conditions. Operation will require multiple sequential shots with minimal time between engagements. Walsh volunteered immediately, understanding that her reconnaissance experience and communication skills made her the logical choice for supporting precision operations. I can provide overwatch and coordination from the security forces building. The elevation will give me clear observation of the entire hangar complex. Williams made his decision with the grim determination of someone whose career was already destroyed, but whose conscience demanded that he minimize the damage to American military capabilities. Sergeant Mitchell, you are authorized to engage enemy positions using whatever means necessary to prevent the theft of United States military aircraft. All available personnel will provide support for your operations. Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar calm that had always preceded her best. Shooting. The institutional barriers that had prevented her from utilizing her skills for 14 months were finally being removed, replaced by operational necessity that demanded excellence rather than bureaucratic compliance. The walk to the control tower took her through sections of the base that were eerily quiet, as if the normal rhythm of military life had been suspended while everyone waited to see whether Riverside Air Force Base would survive the next few hours. As an operational American installation, the sunset was painting the desert landscape in brilliant oranges and purples that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The control tower offered an elevated firing position that provided clear sight lines to the hangar complex where enemy operatives were conducting their theft operations. Through her rifle scope, Sarah could observe the sophisticated coordination that had made their infiltration possible. American military personnel were indeed working alongside hostile operatives, their cooperation suggesting either coercion or genuine collaboration that represented the worst kind of security breach. Sarah's first target was the operational coordinator, a man in civilian clothing who was directing aircraft preparation activities with the authority of someone whose orders were being followed without question. His elimination would disrupt the carefully planned sequence of operations while creating confusion about command structure among the remaining operatives. The range was 847 meters under adverse wind conditions that required precise compensation for atmospheric variables that would affect bullet trajectory. Sarah made her calculations with the methodical precision that Rodriguez had taught her, accounting for temperature, humidity, and wind patterns that created thermal layers in the desert air. Walsh's voice crackled through the radio with real-time intelligence about target movement and positioning. Target Alpha is stationary near aircraft 6 to 891, Clear shot for approximately 30 seconds before he moves to covered position. Sarah controlled her breathing and steadied her heartbeat, feeling the familiar transition from normal awareness to the hyperreal clarity that preceded perfect shots. The crosshairs settled on the target with mathematical precision, accounting for all variables that could affect bullet placement over nearly a kilometer of desert air. The shot broke with the crisp authority of precision equipment, operated by someone who understood exactly how to extract maximum performance from both weapon and ammunition. Sarah's bullet traveled the 847 meters in just over a second, striking the operational coordinator with the devastating accuracy that separated trained marksmen from casual shooters. The immediate effect was exactly what Sarah had predicted. The carefully orchestrated aircraft preparation activities dissolved into confusion as operatives struggled to understand what had happened to their leader. The smooth coordination that had characterized their operation was replaced by urgent radio, communications, and tactical repositioning that suggested they were unprepared for sustained precision fire. "Target down," Sarah reported calmly, already identifying her next engagement priority. "Enemy operations are disrupted." Continuing with sequential target elimination. Her second shot targeted the technical specialist who was supervising aircraft disassembly procedures, eliminating the expertise needed to efficiently prepare the fighters for transport. The range was slightly longer at 923 meters, but the target remained stationary long enough for Sarah to make the precise calculations required for another perfect shot. The pattern continued with methodical precision as Sarah eliminated key personnel whose specific expertise was essential for the success of the theft operation. Each shot was placed with surgical accuracy that demonstrated capabilities far beyond anything available to conventional security personnel. The enemy operation was being systematically dismantled by someone whose skills exceeded their planning and preparation. Walsh provided continuous coordination and intelligence updates, her observations allowing Sarah to prioritize targets and timing with maximum tactical effectiveness. Enemy personnel are taking defensive positions, but maintaining aircraft preparation activities. They appear to be accelerating their timeline in response to sniper fire. Sarah's fourth shot eliminated the explosive specialist who was preparing demolition charges designed to destroy evidence of the theft operation. His death removed the enemy's ability to cover their tracks while ensuring that captured American personnel would survive whatever tactical resolution was ultimately implemented. By her sixth shot, the enemy operation had collapsed from organized theft to desperate evacuation as surviving operatives realized they were facing precision fire that exceeded their ability to counter or escape. The sophisticated plan that had required months of preparation was being destroyed by a single marksman whose capabilities had been systematically underestimated by everyone involved. The radio crackled with intercepted enemy communications as hostile operatives attempted to coordinate evacuation procedures while under continuous precision fire. Their voices carried the frustration and panic of professionals whose careful planning was being undone by tactical variables they had failed to anticipate. Major Williams' voice came through Sarah's radio with the amazed gratitude of someone whose command had been saved by skills he had never suspected existed. "Sergeant Mitchell, enemy forces are retreating from the hangar complex. Aircraft appear to be secure. Outstanding marksmanship." Sarah maintained her firing position while scanning for additional targets, understanding that tactical success required sustained pressure until enemy forces were completely neutralized or evacuated. "Sir, I recommend immediate security sweeps to identify any remaining operatives and to secure captured personnel." The battle for Riverside Air Force Base was effectively over, decided by precision marksmanship that had turned a sophisticated theft operation into a tactical disaster for enemy forces. But Sarah understood that the larger implications of what had occurred would reshape how the military evaluated personnel capabilities and tactical preparedness. As security teams moved to retake the hangar complex and secure the aircraft that had nearly been stolen, Sarah remained at her firing position, providing overwatch for operations that would determine whether any enemy operatives remained on base. The sunset was giving way to desert darkness, and the first stars were becoming visible in the clear Nevada sky. The institutional revolution that had begun with her confrontation at Gate 3 was now complete. The security guard, whose capabilities had been dismissed as irrelevant, had single-handedly prevented the theft of American military aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The same analytical skills that had been considered paranoid overreaction had provided the tactical intelligence needed to identify and counter a sophisticated enemy operation. But Sarah knew that recognition and vindication were secondary considerations compared to the knowledge that American military assets remained under American control. The F-16 fighters that hostile operatives had attempted to steal would continue protecting American interests rather than being reverse-engineered by foreign intelligence services. The radio crackled with reports of captured enemy operatives and evidence that would probably lead to congressional investigations and fundamental changes in military security protocols. The Henderson electronic surveillance operation had been just the visible tip of an intelligence penetration that exceeded anyone's worst-case assumptions about foreign capabilities and American vulnerabilities. As tactical teams secured the base and began the process of investigating how such a massive security breach had been possible, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The journey from dismissed security guard to recognized tactical expert had been completed under circumstances that validated every lesson. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had taught her about the difference between soldiers who could shoot and warriors who could change the outcome of entire operations. The desert wind carried the sound of aircraft engines as F-16 fighters resumed normal operations, their presence in the Nevada sky serving as proof that American air power had survived its closest call since Pearl Harbor. Tomorrow would bring investigations, commendations, and fundamental changes in how the military evaluated and utilized personnel capabilities. But tonight, Sarah Mitchell was exactly who she had always been, the most dangerous person within 1,000 miles when American lives and national security were at stake. The only difference was that finally, everyone else knew it too. 6 months after the Henderson electronics incident, Captain Sarah Mitchell stood in the briefing room of the Advanced Combat Training Center at Nellis Air Force Base, addressing a class of intelligence analysts who hung on every word she spoke. The silver bars on her collar reflected the overhead lighting as she gestured towards satellite photographs that showed the same kind of surveillance patterns she had identified at Riverside. Her audience consisted of seasoned professionals who had come to understand that the quiet observations of security personnel often contained intelligence that traditional analysts missed entirely. The promotion had come with unusual speed, bypassing normal bureaucratic timelines, through direct intervention from Pentagon officials who understood that institutional changes required leadership from people who had experienced institutional failure firsthand. Sarah's transition from gate guard to captain had shattered precedents and created new protocols for identifying and utilizing overlooked talent throughout the military hierarchy. Colonel Patricia Hayes sat in the back of the briefing room, taking notes with the focused attention of someone whose investigation into the Riverside incident had expanded into a comprehensive review of personnel evaluation practices across all service branches. Her initial report about discriminatory training failures had evolved into a blueprint for fundamental reforms that would reshape how the military identified and developed specialized capabilities. The Henderson electronics case demonstrates why conventional threat assessment protocols fail against sophisticated adversaries. Sarah continued, highlighting specific elements of the surveillance operation that had been invisible to traditional security analysis. Professional operatives understand our standard procedures well enough to exploit our institutional blind spots and bureaucratic assumptions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room that the same analytical capabilities being presented as cutting-edge intelligence techniques had been dismissed as paranoid overreaction when exercised by a security guard, whose credibility was considered questionable. Sarah's insights were now being incorporated into training curricula that would prepare future analysts to recognize patterns that previous generations of intelligence professionals had been trained to ignore. Technical Sergeant Kim approached. After the briefing concluded, carrying a folder thick with documentation that represented months of investigation into the security breaches that had made the Riverside attack possible. His analysis had revealed institutional vulnerabilities that extended far beyond simple personnel mistakes into systemic failures that had compromised multiple installations. "Captain," Kim said, his voice carrying the respectful tone that had replaced the casual dismissal that once characterized most interactions with security personnel. "The final report on contractor vetting procedures is ready for your review. The recommendations are going to require fundamental changes in how we evaluate personnel access to sensitive areas." Sarah accepted the folder, understanding that its contents would determine whether the institutional reforms triggered by her actions would be implemented with genuine commitment or allowed to fade into bureaucratic memory. The Henderson electronics operation had been just one example of a broader pattern of security failures that had left American military installations vulnerable to exactly the kind of sophisticated attacks that most defense planners considered impossible. The investigation had revealed that over 40 installations had granted access to contracting companies whose credentials couldn't withstand detailed scrutiny. Background check procedures that relied on paperwork authentication rather than comprehensive investigation had allowed hostile operatives to establish legitimate business identities that provided cover for intelligence gathering operations spanning multiple states and several years. Colonel Hayes joined them as Sarah reviewed Kim's analysis, her expression showing the grim satisfaction of someone whose worst suspicions about institutional dysfunction had been proven accurate through extensive documentation. "Captain Mitchell, I wanted to discuss the congressional testimony scheduled for next month. The Armed Services Committee is particularly interested in your recommendations for preventing similar incidents." The prospect of addressing Congress still felt surreal to Sarah, who remembered spending 14 months as invisible furniture whose observations were considered irrelevant by people who now sought her expertise on matters of national security. But she understood that institutional change required public accountability, and her story had become a symbol of both military failure and military potential that demanded congressional attention. "Colonel, I want to emphasize that the Riverside incident was preventable through existing protocols if those protocols had been properly implemented," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose tactical assessments had been validated under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The problem wasn't inadequate procedures. The problem was institutional prejudice that prevented qualified personnel from performing their assigned duties effectively. Hayes nodded, her investigation having reached similar conclusions through hundreds of interviews and thousands of pages of documentation. The Henderson electronics operation had succeeded not because of sophisticated enemy capabilities, but because American military personnel had been systematically trained to ignore intelligence that didn't conform to their expectations about threats and sources. Staff Sergeant Walsh entered the briefing room carrying the latest intelligence summary from overseas installations where Sarah's analytical techniques were being implemented as standard operating procedures. Walsh had requested transfer to work with Sarah's new training program, understanding that the principles being developed at Nellis would define intelligence analysis for the next generation of military professionals. "Captain, we're getting reports from installations worldwide about suspicious contractor activity that matches the patterns you identified at Riverside," Walsh said, highlighting specific incidents that suggested the Henderson electronics operation had been part of a much broader intelligence campaign. It appears that multiple adversaries have been using similar techniques to gather intelligence about American military capabilities. The scope of the problem was staggering when viewed from the perspective of systematic analysis rather than isolated incidents. Enemy intelligence services had apparently recognized American institutional blind spots and had developed exploitation techniques that took advantage of bureaucratic assumptions and prejudicial dismissal of inconvenient observations. Sarah studied the Global Intelligence Summary, noting patterns that painted a disturbing picture of coordinated surveillance operations that had been ongoing for years, without detection by conventional analysis methods. The techniques she had developed for recognizing hostile reconnaissance were revealing vulnerabilities that exceeded anyone's worst-case scenarios about American security. Major Davis approached with a tablet containing real-time intelligence from installations that were implementing the new security protocols that had emerged from analysis of the Riverside incident. His expression showed the controlled excitement of someone whose previous assumptions about threat detection were being revolutionized by more sophisticated analytical approaches. "Captain, we've identified and interdicted 3 separate intelligence operations in the past month using your pattern recognition techniques," Davis reported, his voice carrying genuine amazement at the effectiveness of analytical methods that most intelligence professionals had never considered. 2 of the operations were in advanced stages of planning attacks similar to the Riverside incident. The success stories were accumulating with frequency that suggested American military installations had been operating under threat levels that exceeded anyone's understanding prior to Sarah's analytical breakthrough. Enemy intelligence operations that had been invisible to conventional detection. Methods were being exposed and neutralized through application of pattern recognition techniques that emphasize detailed observation over bureaucratic assumptions. The afternoon briefing was interrupted by an urgent communication from Pentagon officials who were coordinating response to another suspicious contractor operation at an installation in Germany. The parallels to the Henderson Electronics case were unmistakable, suggesting that enemy intelligence services were implementing coordinated campaigns that spanned multiple continents and targeted American assets worldwide. Sarah found herself consulting on tactical situations that bore striking similarities to the pattern she had identified at Riverside, her expertise now being utilized to prevent attacks rather than merely analyze their aftermath. The institutional transformation that had begun with her confrontation at Gate 3 had expanded into a fundamental revision of how American military installations approached threat detection and personnel evaluation. General Morrison arrived for an unscheduled visit, his presence indicating that developments related to Sarah's case had reached the highest levels of military leadership. At 58, Morrison commanded respect through 3 decades of service. That had included some of the most challenging military operations of the modern era. His decision to personally oversee implementation of the reforms triggered by the Riverside incident demonstrated institutional commitment that exceeded normal bureaucratic responses to security failures. "Captain Mitchell," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose decisions shaped military policy at the strategic level, "I want to discuss your assignment to head the new Threat Assessment Division that's being established at the Pentagon. The position comes with promotion to major and responsibility for implementing your analytical techniques across all service branches." The offer represented validation that exceeded Sarah's most optimistic expectations during those long months, when her capabilities were being systematically dismissed by people who couldn't recognize excellence when it challenged their preconceptions. The journey from gate guard to Pentagon leadership position had been completed in less than a year, proving that institutional barriers could be shattered when circumstances demanded genuine competence over bureaucratic compliance. Sarah accepted the assignment with the understanding that her personal vindication was secondary to the larger mission of ensuring that American military installations never again fell victim to the kind of sophisticated attacks that had nearly succeeded at Riverside. The analytical techniques she had developed would become standard training for intelligence professionals who needed to understand that the most important threats often came from sources that seemed least dangerous. Colonel Hayes approached with the final documentation from her investigation, a comprehensive report that would reshape military personnel evaluation practices and eliminate many of the institutional prejudices that had prevented qualified individuals from utilizing their capabilities effectively. Her work had expanded beyond Sarah's individual case to encompass systematic reforms that would benefit thousands of military personnel whose talents had been overlooked or dismissed. "Major Mitchell," Hayes said, using Sarah's new rank with the satisfaction of someone whose investigation had produced genuine institutional change. The final report documents 47 separate cases where personnel with exceptional analytical capabilities were assigned to routine duties because their assessments didn't conform to conventional expectations. "We're implementing new evaluation protocols that will prevent such waste of human resources." The implications extended far beyond individual career advancement into fundamental questions about how military institutions identified and developed the specialized skills needed for modern warfare. Sarah's case had become a catalyst for broader reforms that would ensure American military effectiveness wasn't compromised by bureaucratic short-sightedness and institutional prejudice. The ceremony at Nellis Air Force Base was attended by senior officials from all service branches, media representatives, and congressional leaders who understood that Sarah's story represented both a cautionary tale about institutional failure and an inspiring example of individual excellence overcoming systematic obstacles. The Distinguished Service Medal she received was recognition not just for her tactical achievements at Riverside, but for her role in triggering reforms that would strengthen American military capabilities for generations. Master Sergeant Rodriguez attended the ceremony, his presence representing completion of a journey that had begun years earlier when he first recognized Sarah's exceptional potential. His pride was evident as he watched his former student receive recognition that validated everything he had taught her about the difference between soldiers who could follow orders and warriors who could change the course of history when circumstances demanded extraordinary performance. The speech Sarah delivered emphasized that individual recognition was less important than institutional commitment to identifying and utilizing exceptional capabilities wherever they existed. Her story had become a symbol of military potential that could be realized when prejudice was replaced by genuine meritocracy and when bureaucratic assumptions were challenged by empirical results. As the ceremony concluded and guests dispersed into the Nevada evening, Sarah stood alone on the base flight line where F-16 fighters were conducting routine operations that had been preserved through her actions at Riverside. The aircraft represented American air superiority that had been maintained because someone had been willing to look beyond surface appearances and recognize patterns that others had missed. The journey from dismissed security guard to Pentagon leadership position had been completed, but Sarah understood that her most important work lay ahead. The institutional changes she had helped trigger needed sustained leadership to ensure that military excellence was consistently recognized and rewarded, regardless of the background or demographics of the individuals who demonstrated it. Tech. Sergeant Kim approached with the latest intelligence summary, his analysis showing continued success in identifying and preventing hostile operations using the techniques that had emerged from the Riverside investigation. Enemy intelligence services were being forced to adapt their methods in response to American capabilities that they had not anticipated, creating strategic advantages that extended far beyond individual tactical victories. The desert sunset painted the Nevada landscape in brilliant colors that reminded Sarah of that afternoon at Gate 3 when everything had changed through a single decision to trust her training over institutional expectations. The choice to engage hostile operatives, despite lacking authorization, had triggered a cascade of events that had reshaped American military culture and demonstrated the potential that existed when excellence was given opportunity to flourish. As night fell over Nellis Air Force Base, Major Sarah Mitchell walked toward her quarters with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose journey from institutional failure to institutional leadership had proven that individual capability could overcome systematic obstacles when supported by courage, competence, and unwavering commitment to mission accomplishment over personal comfort. The story that began with mockery and dismissal had concluded with recognition and responsibility that would define her remaining military service. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to ensure that American military effectiveness continued to evolve in response to sophisticated threats that required equally sophisticated responses. But tonight, for the first time in years, Sarah Mitchell was exactly where she belonged, recognized for her capabilities, valued for her contributions, and positioned to ensure that no other qualified military professional would suffer the institutional blindness that had nearly cost American lives and national security. The stars above the Nevada desert shone with the same brilliance they had displayed on that night at Riverside when precision, marksmanship had prevented national catastrophe. The universe remained unchanged, but the American military had been fundamentally transformed by recognizing that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected sources when institutional barriers were finally removed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.